If you're not familiar, NOAA is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, a federal agency dedicated to the understanding and predicting changes in climate, weather, ocean, and coasts. Today, we're introducing you to Andy Hoell, who will be talking about water, too much water and too little water. But before we start, we'd like to recognize that we're all coming to you from the traditional lands of Native communities who have substantial traditional knowledge to share with us. We acknowledge that our speaker, Andy, today is coming from the lands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and the Ute Nations in Colorado. A few guidelines before I hand you over to Andy. You should stay muted and make sure you keep your cameras off, and you are welcome to use the chat box throughout his whole presentation. We'll be stopping for questions periodically, and especially at the end, we'll answer some questions. So with that, I will send it over to Andy to give his presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be with everybody today to talk about what's the problem with water. You know, water is essential to our lives, and we adapt to a certain amount of water in our environment. So when we have extremes like floods and droughts, you know, we run into some problems. So that's what I'll discuss today. And more generally, how water can shape our lives. So my contact information is at the bottom of the screen if you have any questions or if you'd like to just talk offline. Water is key to our survival. And water, we all know that we can't live without it. And here are some examples as to why it's so important for us. So first is body function. You need to drink water. And if you don't drink water within 3 or 5 days, your body will begin to shut down. And water allows for us to hydrate our cells, to remove for nutrients. And so it's really essential for us. Water is also essential for agriculture. It's essential for the environment, food and forests. So in terms of food, we need water in order to grow our crops. An example here is the wheat that is growing in this field. If it weren't for water, we wouldn't be able to grow much of the food that we would need for our survival. Also, forests are an essential part of our environment just because they take in carbon dioxide and produce oxygen for us to breathe. So we need food and forests in order for us to survive. Also, energy. I think this is one of the areas that is probably least appreciated because we generate a lot of energy because of water. So the image on here is that of the Hoover Dam. So dams work by trapping water against a lake and allowing that water to flow through certain areas so that we can produce energy through turbines. That's a big part of the energy of the Western United States. And also fun. You know, we enjoy the water that we have. And we use it to our advantage. So we need water, but problematically, sometimes we have too much or too little that can create a problematic situation. So here we are. This is the outline of what I'll discuss today. And I'll discuss 3 parts. The first is water, weather, and climate. Essentially how weather and climate shape the water that we have. Weather and climate combined with the land surface to how we store water and how much water we have to use. The next part will be on drought. Drought is the dry extreme of our water cycle, and it's a lack of water. And it causes for situations where we don't have enough water to produce agriculture, vegetation begins to die, we don't have enough water to drink. And then finally with flooding. I'll discuss flooding and extremes in flooding and how they can be disruptive for us. I'll stop after each section to take questions from our audience. So first, I'll begin with water, weather, and climate. The picture on this slide is of the water cycle, and you may all be aware of these kinds of pictures because they're oftentimes used to illustrate how water moves through our environment. Our relationship with water is shaped by weather, climate, and the landscape. And it's important to note that every single place on Earth is very different in how our relationship with water. Precipitation falls differently in every place, different seasons, different times of year, and that when that precipitation falls, it interacts with the land surface. It runs off into rivers and streams, moves its way into lakes. And this is a picture that really gets into the different facets of our water cycle. Now, I'll use this image in order to illustrate some key areas and some very different areas of the United States and why this water cycle is important. So the first place here is I want to talk about a mountainous area that receives much of its precipitation during the winter. And this is from Lake Tahoe, California. Now for us in Colorado, this is very much the same as some of our Colorado mountains and how we receive water and how our relationship with water is. On the right here is what we call a climograph. A climograph shows the average precipitation and temperature for each month of the year. On the x-axis is month of the year, this January, February, March, April, and all the way to December. On the y-axis, what we see is temperature here on the left, and then precipitation here on the right. Precipitation is shown in these blue bars with its axis, y-axis on the right, and temperature here on the left, and that is shown with this line. For areas like Lake Tahoe, California, what we see is that we have a lot of precipitation during the winter time. So January, February, and March, but also November and December. All this precipitation falls primarily as snow. So the snow accumulates on the ground and it stays there in those mountains. And then as the temperatures warm during the year into spring and summer, that snow begins to melt, and that snow melts and then runs off the mountains into streams and makes its way into lakes so that we can use that water at a later time. So areas that are mountainous like Lake Tahoe in California, or even areas like Colorado, very, very important that we get enough snow in the wintertime so that we have enough water for later in the year. Now I'd like to contrast this with two other areas. This first area is called Goodland, Texas, or Goodland, Kansas. Goodland, Kansas is an area just to the east of Colorado, and it's a very important farming area. A lot of the food that we grow and we consume and we eat is made in areas like Goodland, Texas, with this kind of climate. Notice how that the precipitation during the year, shown by these blue bars, is very different from Lake Tahoe. It gets the least amount of precipitation during the winter time, but the most amount of precipitation during the summer. Also note that the temperatures as well increase during the year and reach a maximum during the summer and reach their minimum during the winter. This is really good for areas for us to grow crops. When we have a lot of precipitation in the summer during the warm season, we're able to grow food. And the example on our water cycle here is that we have precipitation that falls during the summer into these fields, and it wets the land surface, and plants like corn are able to grow and use that. When we have a drought, we have a lack of precipitation. This is when areas like Goodland, Texas, or Goodland, Kansas struggle. And another area, an area where I'm from and very familiar with, is Boston, Massachusetts. This is an area that does not have a distinct seasonal cycle of precipitation. Before, when we showed Lake Tahoe, we saw a lot of precipitation during the winter and very little precipitation during the summer. And by contrast, in Goodland, Kansas, what we see is a lot of precipitation during the summer, but little during the winter. Here in Boston, we see, as indicated by these blue bars, a lot of precipitation during every month of the year. Well, when we see a lot of precipitation during every month of the year, what that does is it allows a lot of vegetation and forest to grow. So this is an area of the country where there's a lot of forest cover just because there's a lot of precipitation. And that precipitation allows us to grow all these plants and trees. So just to summarize, all these different areas of the United States and of the globe have very different water cycles and have very different precipitation and temperature during the year. And that right there shapes our relationship with our environment. So before I move on to extremes, I'd like to ask questions from our audience, if there are any.
Yeah, Andy. So you mentioned that there are different locations across the nation have different water cycles. When it comes to climate change, are you noticing something consistent in every place that really links to climate change, or is it different in all those places because their water cycles are so different?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I thank the student for asking that. They're very different. Every single place in the world or even the United States, has a different relationship with the water cycle, and climate change affects every place differently. So for example, in the Western United States, an example from Lake Tahoe is that we tend to get less snowfall during the wintertime because temperatures are warmer. When we get less snowfall, we have less snow on the ground and less snow able to melt off during the summertime. So we have less water resources during the summer. Now, if you look at areas like the Northeast United States where Boston is, there's been a wetting trend. There's been more precipitation there, and as a result of climate change. And as a result of that, they have more water resources and more flooding than they've ever had before. So every place has different effects because of climate change, and a relationship with water in each of those locations is changing.
Thanks, Sandy. Another question, in Colorado, there was the Big Thompson flood. Does that have to do with the water cycle? Is that a thing that you see periodically happen throughout history, or are those one-off events?
Well, flooding events like that do happen periodically through history, but we have noted in many areas of the globe that flooding events are a little bit more severe now than they used to be. And the reason for that is because the atmosphere can hold more water. Because it can hold more water, it can then dump that water on the ground. So floods happen naturally, and a lot of precipitation happens naturally, but climate change helps to increase the amount of water by just a little bit and make floods a little bit worse.
Thanks, Sandy. I think the rest of the questions can wait till your next sections.
Thank you, Sarah. So moving on to drought. Drought is the stream of the water cycle. And what is amazing to me is that by the early 1980s, this was 40 years ago, there were 150 published definitions of drought. And the reason for this is because everybody feels and experiences drought differently, because they have a different relationship, each location, with the water cycle. And the pictures on here are to illustrate these different relationships with the water cycle at certain locations. So for example, in the upper right-hand picture, this is where a lake is drying out. This is in California. And because of prolonged drought in that location, we're seeing this water dwindling in those areas. So in this area, we're experiencing drought in terms of less standing water or lakes. You can contrast that with other areas. This area right here is from the central United States, and this is during the summer. And this is indicative of what we call agricultural drought, meaning that there's so little water in the land surface that it begins to dry out and crack. And then there's other locations like Lake Powell. This is in the western United States. And what we're seeing here are these big lakes and reservoirs that we draw water from, and they're at historically low levels. And you can see how low the water is because you can see this little white band, where this little white band shows where the water typically is. This is indicative of a hydrological drought. Now, drought definitions, they are very varied, and they can be defined with what is important to you. So for example, a drought is a period of abnormally dry weather that to create a serious hydrological imbalance. Most droughts begin as persistent precipitation deficits that move over time into deficits in soil moisture, stream flow, and water storage, leading to a reduction in water supply. This is a definition from the IPCC report, Chapter 3. This is a big international report that reports on the effect of climate change. Now, there are other definitions that can be considered as well, but what's really important here is that there are 4 basic approaches to measuring drought. There's meteorological drought, which is a deficit in precipitation. There's hydrological drought, which is a deficit in the amount of standing water that is in lakes and streams that we can use. There's agricultural drought, which is deficits in soil moisture that prevent crops from growing normally. And then finally, socioeconomic drought, which is simply the effect of different areas of drought on our economy and on us. Now, this is a picture that shows the different types of droughts and their effects on us. What this picture shows is the duration of the drought, whether from weeks to months to seasons to years and to decades, and also the different type of drought we have here, and also the effect on us as people, which is called socioeconomic. Drought is thought of as a cascading hazard, meaning that begins in one area, but then moves to many different areas as it intensifies. So as I said before, droughts tend to begin as a meteorological drought, where precipitation is just too low to satisfy any type of demand that we might have in our society. So in areas like Goodland, Texas, for instance, where we have a lot of precipitation during the summertime, if we have less precipitation during the summertime, that right there will create a precipitation deficit that falls below our demand. Now, when we have low precipitation, the first effect of that is on agricultural drought. And what that simply does is it decreases the amount of water in soils that we have. The agricultural droughts, as we see them, those create a situation where our plants and our crops really suffer. The effect of that is to create crop stress. And if we have enough crop stress and we can't grow our crops, that creates issues with food security, meaning we simply don't have enough food to eat. Now, if we have long enough meteorological and agricultural droughts, those turn into hydrological droughts. What happens in a hydrological drought is we have low surface and subsurface water. What this means is that our lakes begin to decrease, the level of our lakes decrease, we have less water in our rivers, and as a result, we have low water. This creates water shortages. And if we have too little water, then it creates a situation where we have little electricity generation. In this picture, what we're showing is the Hoover Dam. In the Hoover Dam, you can see that a hydrological drought is ongoing because of this white band is showing where the lake level tends to be. If water levels get too low, we don't have water flowing through the dam that can create power. And then finally, if we have so little water, this creates stress on living organisms. You can see here in this picture that this tree has died because prolonged drought has created a situation where there is not enough water for it to survive. If we have ecological drought, this creates wildfires. It hurts ecosystems and diversity, meaning that we have so few animals that can live, and also it affects wildlife. So wildlife, like migrating birds, for instance, they can note where water is not present, and they can see where the ecology, like these trees, have died, and they won't go back to those areas. Wildlife will go to different areas if they note a drought in the area they typically go to. Ways to measure drought. Meteorological drought is a precipitation deficit, and you can measure meteorological drought by taking a rain gauge and trying to measure precipitation over long periods of time. And this is a very easy way to be engaged in the science and be a citizen scientist by looking at precipitation. Agricultural drought is measured by soil moisture. With soil moisture, we can put sensors in the soil, and those sensors will allow us to measure how much water is in the soil to determine if we have an agricultural drought. The next type of drought, hydrological drought, is measured by stream flow or reservoir levels. This picture right here is of a measurement station along a river. And what this does is it measures how much water is flowing through this point and also notes how much water, the water level at this point. So we have sensors across the United States and across the world that measure streams and stream flows and therefore hydrological drought. And then finally, there's ecological drought, where we have our scientists go into the field and they can note the effect of drought on vegetation. So this tree right here has died because of ecological drought, for drought that has lasted a long period of time. And as scientists, we go into the field and we note all these trees that have suffered because of drought. Drought monitoring is very, very difficult. And the reason for that is because there's so many different ways to measure drought that I showed previously, that we rely on what is called the US Drought Monitor. The US Drought Monitor takes experts and they use all ways of monitoring drought, meteorological, agricultural, hydrological, and they determine how intense drought is across the United States. The US Drought Monitor measures drought as abnormally dry, moderate drought, severe drought, extreme drought, and exceptional drought. And you can see here on the right, the map, a map that was created on October 11th to measure drought across the United States. This map right here shows that on October 11th, there was a lot of drought widespread across the United States, from the Southwest United States into the central Great Plains and also into the northern Great Plains as well. And this was caused by persistently low precipitation that turned into agricultural droughts and hydrological droughts over all these areas. Now, what does abnormally dry mean? What does moderate drought mean? Well, abnormally dry means that we have short-term dryness slowing plant growth or crops and pastures. This right here is technically not drought, but is oftentimes a harbinger of things to come when it comes to drought. It just means there's abnormal dryness. Well, when this abnormal dryness gets worse, it then turns into different categories and severities of drought. It turns into moderate drought. Moderate drought damages crops and pastures and leads to water shortages. Then there's severe drought. Severe drought leads to crop or pastures shortages, water shortages, and water restrictions. And then finally, extreme drought, there's major crop losses, major water shortages, and finally, exceptional drought, which is the worst kind of drought where we see very bad effects on the land surface, on moisture, and it's a very bad situation for us and for the people that live in these areas. The southern Great Plains, like Kansas and Oklahoma and even Nebraska, suffered a very bad drought this summer, and this led to crop losses and low water in these areas. Now, drought forecasting is very complicated and difficult to do well. So you can imagine it's very difficult to measure drought, and drought forecasting is just as hard. So what we do in NOAA is NOAA forecasters consider current conditions and precipitation and temperature and wind forecasts, which is all very hard to do. So what we need to know is we need to know the conditions that are happening right now on the land surface and how dry they are. And then what we need to do is we need to forecast conditions of the land surface because of precipitation and temperature and wind to determine what future drought may be. This right here is NOAA's monthly drought outlook. And what it shows is where the forecasters think that drought will persist, where drought will remain but improves, where drought removal, where drought will go away, or where drought will develop. As you can see here over the United States, this is a forecast that was released at the end of September of 2022, that drought was forecast to persist across much of the United States, as indicated by these brown colors, and then drought was likely to develop where these yellow colors are. And then here in the eastern United States, there are some pockets of drought in New England that were forecast to persist at that time. Now, what is climate change doing to droughts, and how is it affecting our relationship with the environment? Well, climate change increases temperatures, and because of those increases in temperatures, it creates a demand from the atmosphere that is higher for water. And because of that, the land surface dries out that much quicker because of those higher temperatures. Climate change also changes precipitation intensity as well, which has effects on the land surface. All of these changes that we're seeing at these locations because of higher temperatures and changes in precipitation intensity, those alter changes in the water cycle. And those changes in the water cycle are happening just in many different places. This map is very complicated, but what it does is it helps to synthesize a lot of the varied effects they see in terms of the effect of climate change on droughts. So that finishes up drought. Are there any questions from our students that may be watching?
So we did have a question. I think you kind of answered it, but maybe you can go into it a little bit more. What would happen if you absolutely can't get enough water due to drought?
Yeah, that's a great question. Drought is we oftentimes call it an insidious problem. If you can't get enough water due to drought, you have to get your water from elsewhere. And if you can't get enough water due to drought and it kills your agriculture, you'll have to get crops from elsewhere. And here in the United States, we're very good about communicating drought and transferring water and crops to places that may be struggling because of drought. And that helpful nature within the United States is very nice. Unfortunately, there are parts of the world where they don't have those luxuries, where folks, they can't grow their crops and they don't have enough water, so they have to move to different places. And that's prevalent in many areas in Eastern Africa, where we have what are called pastoralists, where they move around from location to location just because the environment in one location may not be good for them to live in. But here in the United States, thankfully, we tend to have that capacity to be able to cope because we have friendly neighbors that can help us.
Thanks, Andy. That actually leads into the next question. The students are talking about how they've heard that deserts like the Sahara Desert used to be very lush environments and now is fully a desert. So they're curious if you guys can predict really far out and figure out where another desert will eventually be that might be lush right now.
That's a great question. And I don't think we can predict with much certainty about that. But what we've noted is that within those areas that we call semi-arid, which were the Sahara Desert before it became a desert, what happens is because of climate change, with those increases in temperature, they're increasing the margins of those deserts ever so slightly, just because they once were able to support life because of precipitation and lower temperatures. But now, because of higher temperatures, it's increasing the width or the extent of that in north and south direction that create that cause for these deserts to be a little bit bigger.
And last question, they're noticing that you're using a lot of what looks like drone pictures for like the Hoover Dam. Do you guys use satellite images to detect drought as well?
Absolutely. Yeah, satellite images are a very valuable tool in monitoring the hydrological cycle. So for example, what we could do is we could look at satellite images that map the amount of water on the land surface, and we can compare different one year to the next to see how different the size of those bodies of water are. And it's a very valuable tool for us to be able to monitor drought and understand how to cope with it.
I think you're good to move on to the next section.
Thank you, Sarah. So moving on next to floods, like we were discussing before, droughts are the extreme lack of water. But on the other hand, floods are the extreme excess of water that also create situations that are hard for us to cope with. There are three different types of floods, and what I'll do is I'll describe them and their causes. So on the left, these are what we call river floods. River floods are caused by prolonged precipitation that cause for water levels in streams and lakes to rise. So for example here, if our normal water level is this lighter blue color, and we get a lot of precipitation through time, this water level will rise because all the precipitation is settling into this lake. The water will rise and it will then flood certain areas, like this home right here. So this home right here, if this water overflows the lake, it will then be flooded by a river flood. The second flood is a flash flood. What happens during a flash flood is we get extreme precipitation over a short period of time. And because of that, water begins to pool in a certain area. And the water pools in those areas just because the water doesn't have enough time to drain away, to move away from that location. Flash floods are really hazardous because they happen very quickly and you can't foresee them. And as a result, oftentimes what you see during flash floods is areas in urban areas like New York City, for example, you can then get cars that get underwater or even subway systems. So a recent example was from a recent summer where in New York City, they had an exceptional precipitation event in a short period of time, and all that water flowed into the subway and flooded the subway and made it so that people couldn't ride trains. And then finally, there's coastal floods. So with coastal floods, what happens is we have water that is being pushed by the wind. Oftentimes we see coastal floods during hurricanes, where hurricanes are pushing water on to the coastline and then flooding homes that may be along the coast. So these are three very different types of flooding that are very damaging. Now, when it comes to flood forecasting, NOAA has a very intricate network of flood forecasters called river forecast centers. And there are many different forecast centers across the United States. There are 12 of them. And they're separated by what we call river basins. River basins are places on the land surface that are created by the topography so that water flows into them. So an example is the Missouri Basin. So in the Missouri Basin, all the water that flows within this area, that falls in the area, then flows to the Missouri River. It flows into the middle here along the Missouri River, and then moves out of the Missouri River Basin like so. The same applies for all these different areas where water simply falls in the form of precipitation and then moves into rivers and then flows into the ocean. These river forecast centers are very, very helpful because they allow us to be able to monitor and foresee what flooding may be and the consequences may be at some point in the future. Now, in terms of flood forecasting is very difficult, like drought forecasting. So this is an example from the Missouri River Basin River Forecast Center, where there are all these monitoring stations at these different locations that are very important because it's where people live. And what forecasters do is they consider current moisture in the land surface and the future precipitation to be able to judge what flooding may be at a location. Now, what we see here is that the soil moisture has a big effect on flooding. And the reason for that is because when we see precipitation, the precipitation is then absorbed by the land surface. Well, if soils are saturated, what happens is the precipitation will fall, and then that precipitation won't be able to be absorbed by the land surface. It'll then run off into rivers and streams and increase those streams. So when the land surface is very wet, we tend to see flooding because of precipitation that may fall on top of it. Now, what is climate change likely to do for flood risk? Well, climate change has a number of different effects that we discussed before, but it also increases flood risk, just in the same way that it may increase drought risk. And this is a very nice example from colleagues in Australia, where they outline specific instances of how flooding may be affected by climate change. What happens first is that the atmosphere warms up under climate change. Because the atmosphere warms under climate change, a warmer atmosphere can hold more moisture, that can then rain out. And that's exactly what happens. So it holds about 7% more moisture for every degree of warming. And as a result, we tend to see 7% more precipitation with extreme events. Now, what also happens is, in terms of storms that may develop, like hurricanes, there's more energy for them to draw upon because the atmosphere in the ocean is warmer. So in terms of a hurricane, if a hurricane is moving over warmer waters, it has the ability to generate more energy from that water than it did previously. And as a result, these hurricanes and weather systems become more intense. They have more precipitation associated with them. They also have more wind associated with them so that we can get coastal flooding, but also river flooding as well. Because of the warmer and wetter atmosphere, we have more intense downpours. Like I said before, because the atmosphere can hold more water, there's more available to rain, and that creates more intense downpours. And as a result of that, we tend to see greater precipitation and greater flooding. And then finally, because we have more energy available for storms, winds are greater. And if winds are greater, what that does is it creates more coastal flooding. So that right there finishes our section on flooding. And I'd like to ask if there are any questions from the students attending.
They want to know what forecast center covers Hawaii.
I actually don't know the answer to that. Hawaii does have a weather forecast office. So there are forecasts that are made by the National Weather Service there, but I'm not sure of which river forecast center covers that. It could just be the weather forecast office there.
Okay. They also want to know what's more dangerous, flooding or drought?
Oh, wow. I wouldn't assign danger as drought being worse than flooding because they're just very different in terms of the way they sort of behave. So for example, flooding happens pretty quickly. Sometimes you can have a flash flood that comes and goes within a few days. Sometimes you can have other floods that last a few weeks, all of which create a lot of damage in terms of the infrastructure that they knock down. Drought, on the other hand, tends to last longer than flooding. And as a result, you can have a very costly drought over the course of a few years. So I would say that they're both equally effective and impactful on us as a society, but they just behave in very different ways and on very different timescales. So I don't think it's a fair comparison to say that drought is worse than floods or floods are worse than drought. They're both very bad and something that we have trouble coping with sometimes.
So this question is a little bit similar to the Sahara question in the drought section. They're curious if, due to climate change, are there states that are starting to flood that did not flood before?
Oh, that's a great question. We've had flooding and reports of flooding over many different every area of the country just naturally. So even in the absence of climate change, every part of our country has had flooding in the past. There's just been more prevalent flooding in areas where we have seen more precipitation now than say we did 100 years ago. So for one example, and I'll go back to the slide on the river forecast centers, the central part of the country here has seen an exceptional amount of extreme precipitation events in the last 30 or so years. And as a result of that, we've seen a lot of flooding along the Missouri River that's caused a lot of damage in terms of infrastructure. The northeastern part of the country, on the other hand, is a place that has seen a lot more precipitation, extreme precipitation as well. And that has been attributed to climate change, where that part of the country has seen increases in precipitation events, and those precipitation events are linked to climate change. So those are two areas where we've seen more flooding under climate change, and as a result, we're seeing more flooding as well.
Thank you. And this question, I'm going to try to make sure I get the point of what you're asking. It sounds like they're asking you, we've built a lot of cities and poured a lot of concrete and roads and things. Does that mean that those places might flood because there's no longer soil to absorb the water when it goes through those places?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fantastic question. When we pour concrete, and concrete now dominates the land surface, the concrete does not absorb water like soils do. And as a result, when that water falls, it then has to run off. And because of that, in urban areas, we now see more flooding with intense precipitation. The example that I used before of New York City is a good example of that, where when we have an extreme precipitation event, that water then has to flow off of the concrete because it can't be absorbed, and then it flows to the lowest location, that is subways. So those areas that we have built up with concrete, those are areas that we will see more flooding. Another area is actually the central United States, where they've tiled the land surface. And in tiling the land surface, it's similar to putting concrete down, where you cannot, the land surface cannot absorb the water like it did before. And that too is where we see a lot of flooding, because the water then runs off and then goes to the lowest location, like a river or like a lake, and those areas then flood like they didn't before.
Okay, only 2 questions left. One is, has flooding ever moved species like fish to a new location and spawned a new I'm guessing, species of fish in that new location?
I'm not aware of that. That's a great question, and I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. Flooding is actually a way that the land surface changes. So I'll go back to the Yellowstone floods that we saw this summer. Those Yellowstone floods actually carved out a new river along the Yellowstone River, a new area that the river flows. And it's these extreme precipitation events that actually reshape the land surface. So I wouldn't be surprised if that happens, but I don't have an example to be able to share with you.
And the last question is, they want to know if you get to go out to these sites, either drought or flood sites, and what do you do when you get to go out to the sites?
Well, sometimes I'll go out to the sites. My area of research is principally in understanding these kinds of events for the application to fire and water security and food security. So oftentimes what I will do is I will travel to work with people who make these forecasts. And sometimes we go on field trips and sometimes they show me around because it's relevant to the kind of work that we're doing. But me personally, much of a field scientist where I make measurements myself. I tend to look at the data that's provided and try to provide a physical understanding from the work that we do based on that data of why these events exist and how we can forecast them better.
So it sounds like you get to work with the people who are experiencing this, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
I think that's all of the questions from the students. Thank you very much to Andy for this presentation today. And if you have any additional questions, you can always reach out to me, or Andy provided his information at the beginning of this presentation. So I will go ahead and quit the meeting for everybody, and I hope you all have a very, very good day.